The heavy glass revolving door had just sealed behind her when a cold, cutting voice rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the opulent, light-drenched lobby. The VIP lounge doesn't accommodate walk-ins. If you'd like a tour, please return another time. The words were aimed at no one else but the woman, standing still in her ash-gray linen dress, worn-down flats, and a faded canvas bag hanging from her shoulder, an appearance completely out of place in a space where satin dresses, gold watches, and luxury perfumes wove together an unspoken language she clearly did not speak. The air in the lobby seemed to thicken strangely. Polite laughter tapered off. Glances that had only briefly brushed over her now stopped fixing on her as if she had emerged from a basement rather than through the front door of the city's most expensive building. A man in a navy tuxedo, holding a champagne flute, tilted his head and said loudly enough for everyone in the area to hear, "Who is she? Looks like someone who wandered in after buying groceries." The woman next to him, with blood-red lips and a smile, colder than the air conditioning, let out a soft laugh, then added, with a venomous edge, "Maybe she thinks this is a janitor job interview." She didn't respond, didn't flinch. She simply stood there calmly, as if her silence itself was the most expensive reply they could never afford to understand. Beneath the crystal chandelier, casting its spotlight-like glow, she didn't appear poor. She looked like a tiny crack on a flawless wall, not large, but enough to make those who paid attention feel slightly unsettled. And in that moment, no one in the lobby, not even the ones laughing, realized they had just volunteered themselves for a test whose answer was already staring back at them with unwavering eyes. She didn't walk away. She didn't turn her back, didn't apologize for existing, and didn't offer a single word of explanation or defense. Her silence, to those accustomed to judging, felt like a nameless defiance, and that unsettled them. It irritated the crowd. A younger staff member pulled out a townhouse brochure and placed it on the counter, wearing a strained, polite smile that barely concealed his condescension. "Perhaps you'll find the properties on the city outskirts more suitable. We have offers for those just starting out." A woman with curled blonde hair, wrapped in a skin-tight dress that shimmered like the scaled skin of some rare serpent, looked her up and down from the worn shoes to the crown of her head, then curled her lips into a smirk. "Or you could try calling an Uber and taking a virtual tour online. No one there judges what you're wearing." A ripple of laughter sparked like static through the room, the kind that doesn't need to erupt fully to sting. An older man, voice low but frosted, shook his head and muttered to his wife, "I don't get it. People like that, what gives them the right to even step in here?" No one asked her name. No one cared why she was here. To them, she wasn't a person, just an intrusion to be swiftly removed. And yet she remained, hands gently resting on the strap of her canvas bag, eyes unflinching fixed on the Penthouse model displayed at the center of the lobby, a model that everyone here secretly yearned for, but firmly believed she had no business even dreaming about. Some assumed she was slow to understand. Others thought she was waiting for someone. But no one considered the truth. She was observing. And every word spoken, every glance, cast, every brittle laugh crackling through the haze of champagne and perfume, she took it all in, not for revenge, but to measure the true depth of the shallowness in those who thought themselves at the summit of the world. In this world of the elite, everyone longs to be looked up to, but trembles when someone like her looks down, without ever needing to climb a single step of the staircase they built. 1 minute, then 2. Her unnervingly steady presence began to distort the atmosphere in the lobby as if someone had gently turned down the volume on all the glitz and glamour, revealing sounds people usually tuned out, the echo of heels on cold marble, the isolated chime of a spoon against a glass, and the sudden quickening of heartbeats from those perceptive enough to feel something was off. A young intern, his brown hair neatly trimmed and a clipboard in hand, was briskly walking by when he abruptly stopped. He couldn't explain why, only that her eyes had met his for the briefest moment, sharp enough that he instinctively lowered his gaze as though he had just made a mistake. This woman wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She didn't possess the kind of beauty that screamed royalty or the kind of style that whispered wealth. But there was something in her gaze, the way it cut clean through the room, as if every sneer and scoff was merely a thin mist incapable of hiding what she was truly seeing. She wasn't angry. She didn't flinch. She simply watched. And that quiet, unwavering observation gradually pushed the entire space into a state of subconscious tension. From across the room, the blonde woman who had mocked her earlier suddenly frowned and leaned toward her boyfriend, speaking in a hushed tone. "Do you think she's strange?" Her boyfriend didn't reply. He looked again, shrugged, but this time there was no disdain in his expression, just a flicker of something unsettled. Then something small shifted the balance entirely. The lobby manager, a man in his 40s, known for silently sorting people into categories, with just one glance began walking over. He didn't hurry, but his movement was intentional. And strangely, he didn't ask her to leave. He didn't wear the rehearsed smile of someone resolving an incident. Instead, he stood still and studied her closely enough that others nearby started to glance at one another. Just a few seconds passed, and then he stepped back one step. No one knew why. But the entire room seemed to pause breathless, not because she had done anything, but precisely because she hadn't. And yet someone still stepped back. A man dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit was mid-conversation with a business partner when his gaze absently swept across her. At first, he registered nothing unusual, but a few seconds later, he paused mid-sentence, as if he had just seen a familiar figure that his brain hadn't yet processed. His eyes quickly scanned her face, then dropped to her hand, gripping the strap of the canvas bag. And in that precise moment, barely perceptible, his expression shifted. It wasn't her appearance that gave him pause. It was because he had seen that hand before, in a place no one else in this lobby could possibly imagine. That woman, the one whose face had once briefly appeared in a meeting reserved solely for the highest executive board. He couldn't recall her name, but the feeling was unmistakable. A chill down his spine, a flicker of disquiet, as if he were standing before someone who absolutely shouldn't be here. At least not like this. Across the lobby, a young woman, an intern in real estate, was getting water from the refreshment station when she overheard her team leader whisper, "Hey, do you see that woman? Something's off about her." "Who do you think she is?" the intern asked, unable to hide her unease. But instead of answering, the man simply furrowed his brow and exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure, but I just saw Mr. Lawrence nod at her. He never acknowledges strangers." Then, like a chain reaction, the atmosphere began to shift. The mocking laughter faded. The scornful stares turned into quick, uneasy glances. The young security guard, the first one who had considered approaching her to escort her out, was now standing off to the side, gripping his walkie-talkie as if waiting for orders from someone higher up. But no order came. Instead, there was silence. A strange kind of silence, not born from declared authority, but from the kind of unspoken presence that commands a room before it's even introduced. And then a soft ting echoed through the lobby. The luxury elevator behind her had opened. Everyone turned as if clinging to a momentary distraction from the suffocating weight of uncertainty closing in on them. But as the elevator doors shut behind another guest, their eyes slowly drifted back to her, because now they were beginning to understand the mistake wasn't that she walked in. The mistake was assuming they had the right to judge someone far beyond what their world could comprehend. No one knew that just 8 years ago, that very woman had once knelt on this same cold marble floor, not to beg, but to gather the documents that had been ripped from her hands. Back then, she had nothing, no status, no money, no prestigious scholarship, no mentor. Only a business plan rejected by the very board now hosting today's grand property launch. The same people who once told her, "Women like you don't understand real estate. You're better suited for sales." She didn't argue. She simply gathered her papers in silence and walked out of this building under the pitying gaze of the receptionist and the awkward eyes of the friend who had accompanied her that day, a friend who later erased all traces of their connection after joining a rival firm. No one noticed that she kept returning over the next 3 years, quietly, discreetly sitting across the street just to take notes on staff behavior, spatial layout, and customer interaction. They thought she had disappeared, but in truth, she was preparing. And now, standing here in the very place that once treated her like a societal stain, it was her calmness that unsettled everything. The man from earlier, who had finally recognized exactly who she was, began to feel sweat forming along the back of his neck, not out of guilt, but from a fear that whispered, if she didn't come today to buy a unit, did she come to buy the entire building? At a distant VIP table, a middle-aged man, in refined, dark tailoring, Mr. Lawrence, quietly dialed a number. "I need an updated file on Celine Ashford." That name echoed through the phone like a spell that shattered every mask teetering in that lobby. Celine Ashford, the founder and CEO of Ashford Capital, a private equity firm known for dozens of silent but lethal acquisitions. A name rarely seen because Celine never needed to show up. She let her money speak for her. But today, she stood here, in a faded grey dress, quiet, no fanfare, no name tag, and the entire lobby was part of her next move. "Are you sure? It's her." The voice of the regional director on the other end of the call trembled slightly. "I'm sure. I could never forget those eyes. The last time I saw them was when she walked out of that boardroom carrying the proposal you tore in half and threw into the trash in front of the entire executive team." A silence stretched out taut like wire, then a sharp intake of breath. God, why is she here? Who invited her? At that very moment, Celine remained still. She didn't rush to move, nor did she rush to speak, but her silence felt like an invisible indictment, each glance cast in her direction, carrying a silent question. What does she know? And what is she going to do? At the far end of the lobby, a senior manager, the same man who had once submitted a falsified internal report that cost Celine her funding opportunity, quietly pulled out his phone and opened the shareholder list. When he saw the name Ashford Capital, holding over 18% of the current shares, his face turned pale. He didn't need to ask anyone anything else. He understood. She hadn't come to buy a unit. She had already bought the company, and then like a silent line of falling dominoes, people across the lobby began searching for her name on their phones. At first, the murmurs were hushed, but soon everyone knew. The woman they had mocked, the one they told to take a virtual tour online or call an Uber and go elsewhere, was in fact the largest shareholder, the new principal investor, the person who now held power over every square foot of this place. A young woman, the same intern, who had earlier been sent to make coffee, looked at Celine with wide eyes, not out of fear, but with a choked admiration. She whispered, "She used to be one of us," and they pushed her out. Meanwhile, the lobby manager, the one who had just moments earlier almost asked her to leave, stepped back, his face white as a sheet. But Celine didn't even look at him. She walked toward the display model of the condominium, lightly touched the glass wall, and spoke a single sentence, quiet, yet sharp as a blade. "They once said, I didn't have the dream to build this. Now I will tear it down and rebuild it with the pride of everyone they once looked down on." The grand lobby had grown so quiet that every tap of Celine's heels against the marble floor rang out with crystalline clarity. She said very little, simply placed a small USB on the reception desk, the same desk where just this morning she had been asked to verify her identity. A nervous IT staffer plugged it into the central display system. No one expected that within seconds the atmosphere would become as heavy as lead. The screen lit up with leaked internal emails. It started with falsified performance reviews and mocking remarks behind her back about the girl without a degree, then moved on to plans that had been deliberately altered to push Celine out of the funding program 8 years ago. The laughter embedded in the emails, the insults masked as healthy competition, now flashed under the lobby's gleaming chandeliers like an indictment no one could deny. The crowd fell into absolute silence. Many couldn't bear to look at the screen. Some lowered their heads. The senior manager, the one who had once thrown her proposal to the floor, stepped forward shakily, trying to speak. But Celine turned to him, eyes calm and steady. "I didn't come here to take your job," she said. "I came to prove you were never qualified to keep it." A few members of the leadership team rose as if to intervene. But just then, a man exited the elevator, the current chairman of the corporation. He raised his hand. "Don't." He walked up to Celine, looking at her not with the eyes of a superior, but with the gaze of a man who once had everything, now facing a woman he and his peers had once deemed insignificant. "What do you plan to do with this place?" he asked. The question carried no command, only acknowledgement. Celine didn't need to pause. She replied, "I'll turn it into the first place, where those who were shut out of the real estate dream can begin again, priced exactly at what was stolen from them." Applause broke out, not from the elite, but from the staff, from the young professionals who had once been overlooked for not having a perfect resume, from the intern who had watched Celine with awe the entire time, and from the security guard now standing tall as if witnessing a ceremonial changing of the guard. 2 weeks after the chaotic unveiling, the once lavish building, once a symbol of exclusion, elitism, and the arrogance of the upper class, now bore a new name: Ashford Commons, a home for the overlooked. The extravagant golden signage had been replaced with reclaimed oak wood, just like the way Celine chose to rebuild a culture that had rotted from the inside out. She didn't fire anyone, but she didn't have to. Those who had once mocked her quietly resigned, unable to bear the presence of a woman they had once looked down on, now standing at the very top, not by revenge, but by the one value: she never lost integrity. At the first press conference of Ashford Commons, Celine didn't speak of those who had humiliated her. She didn't recount the 8 years of silent endurance. She simply stood there, holding the hand of the intern from before, now a full-time employee, and said, "I didn't rebuild this place for revenge. I did it so people like her would never have to go through what I did." The room seemed to hold its breath. A single mother in the audience began to cry. A struggling college student clutched his job application tightly, And those watching the live stream, people who had once been dismissed, labeled not good enough, finally felt seen. Because Celine's story was no longer just hers, it belonged to everyone who had ever been shut out of a dream because of where they came from, what they looked like, or what they lacked. She didn't scream, retaliate, or wield her power as a weapon. She simply survived, rose, and turned the very system that once cast her aside into a door others could now walk through. And when someone asked, "Do you forgive them?" Celine only smiled softly like wind, brushing over a rooftop. "I don't need to forgive. I just need to prove that kindness, even when buried, remains the strongest foundation upon which anything can be rebuilt." People once believed justice had to be loud, slamming fists, raising voices, dragging things to court. But Celine Ashford's reversal of fate arrived in a chilling kind of silence, the kind only known by those who have been deeply wounded, yet never allowed their scars to rob them of grace. When the screen displayed the flood of internal emails, lines filled with contempt, cruel jokes about the girl who wasn't qualified, project proposals deliberately altered to undermine her, no one in that opulent room dared to laugh anymore. They saw themselves exposed, not through a speech, not through a strike, just through the truth, revealed at exactly the right moment, without a single excuse. Celine didn't point fingers. She didn't shout. She simply stood there, her gaze calm, her voice steady, each word landing like a mirror, forcing people to face themselves. She didn't ask, "Why did you treat me this way?" She simply said, "I'm standing here, not to make anyone kneel, but to help them see the way they treated others is what cost them their place." And in that moment, the head of the corporation, once hailed as the face of the industry, quietly stepped forward, removed the powerful name badge from his lapel, and handed it to Celine. No grand speeches, no performative applause, only a nod and the eyes of hundreds watching her, not with pity anymore, but with awe. No one was fired that day, yet many chose to leave on their own, because they understood this place would no longer be a stage for those better at performing than living. Celine didn't teach them a lesson with words, she made them remember it through shame. And that is true power, when you don't need to prove you belong. Because your presence, your resilience, and the kindness you never let go of already speak louder than anything you could ever say. 1 year after the upheaval that forced the luxury real estate industry into a long overdue reckoning, Celine Ashford was no longer just a headline tied to a spectacular takedown. She had become a symbol, not of power, but of a quiet, unshakable rise. The building that once bore the aristocratic name of the elite had been completely transformed, not just in its operations, but in the energy it radiated, a space where no one was judged for their appearance, background, or title. A place where you were welcomed simply for being who you truly are. On the first anniversary of Ashford Commons, Celine walked on stage not in an evening gown or a commanding power suit, but in the simple outfit she once wore as a temporary staffer. The entire hall fell silent. She didn't need a formal speech. She simply shared slowly, piece by piece, the story of the day she was pushed out of an elevator for not dressing appropriately, of the dismissive look from the receptionist, of that casual shove, like brushing aside something that didn't belong in a place supposedly meant only for the qualified. But she didn't tell it with bitterness. She spoke it with the voice of someone who had forgiven. Not forgiven them, but forgiven herself, for once believing, maybe I don't belong here. And then she looked down at the front row where the cleaning crew sat, the delivery worker, the scholarship-winning student from the Ashford Fund, and even the receptionist from that day, now the official operations supervisor. Celine smiled. There wasn't a hint of arrogance. "I didn't rebuild this place to become a symbol. she said softly. I rebuilt it so that anyone who has ever felt not enough would know there's always a door open, one they don't have to change their voice, their posture, or their dreams to walk through. That single sentence became the most shared quote on social media that year. Millions reposted it, not because it was poetic, but because it voiced something they had never dared to admit out loud. And as the crowd rose in applause, not for glamour, but out of genuine gratitude, Celine took a step back quietly, just as she had entered this journey without fanfare, without challenge, but leaving behind a legacy that could no longer be undone. A place that once made her feel small, now bore her name and stood for the millions who never had theirs spoken aloud. Not long after the one-year anniversary of Ashford Commons, a letter from the Global Leadership Forum arrived directly at Celine's office. No intermediaries, no official spokesperson. Just a plain white envelope, hand-addressed in blue ink. We want you to become the face of a new generation of leadership, one that governs not with power, but with humanity. Celine read the letter on an ordinary afternoon, over an old cup of coffee. Yet something in her gaze shifted subtle, not excitement, but the quiet realization that another chapter was beginning. And this time, she wouldn't be walking alone. When invited to speak at the Forum in Geneva, a stage once reserved only for tycoons, heads of state, and world-famous CEOs, Celine stepped up not as a winner, but as someone who had once been excluded from that very stage for not looking the part. But today, people no longer remember her for her humility or her past wounds. They rose to their feet because she had proven what few dared to believe. That kindness could be a strategy, and a quiet rise could move the world more deeply than any roar ever could. In a speech that lasted less than 10 minutes, Celine didn't use lofty words. She showed no charts and recited no accolades. She simply said, if I could teach the next generation one thing, it wouldn't be how to claim a seat. It would be how to build the seat that others once said you didn't deserve to sit in. The hall fell utterly silent, as if everyone in that moment saw a reflection of themselves in her words. 3 months later, Celine was invited to co-found the Global Institute for Human-Centered Leadership, a mission-driven academy for young entrepreneurs, founders, and social change-makers built on 3 pillars. Integrity doesn't need validation. Success should never come from stepping on others. Power must lift, not crush. And across the world, from waitresses to law students, from invisible workers to unheard voices, those who had once felt unseen began calling her by a single name, the woman who made silence powerful. The day Celine Ashford received an email from Amara Voss, the former HR director who had once fired her without hesitation, was the same day she returned from the Global Young Leaders Summit in Kyoto. The subject line read only 3 words, for what it's worth. Inside, there was no rambling, no justification, no mention of work pressure, or I didn't know who you were back then. Just one brief paragraph, I was wrong. Not because you're a CEO now, but because I realized I once clipped someone's dreams simply because I didn't like the dress she wore that day. And now I stand where you once stood on the margins, excluded from the system I once thought I belonged to. Celine read the email and sat in silence. Her face showed no emotion. But that night, she couldn't sleep. The following week, Amara appeared at Ashford Commons, not with cameras, not for a public apology, not as a stunt. She came as someone searching, not for a second chance at a career, but for a second chance at meaning. Her hair was shorter, her face is thinner. But there was something in her eyes, the quiet fatigue of someone who had finally tasted what it felt like to be dismissed. Celine didn't make her speak much. She asked just one question. You once made me believe I didn't belong here. Now, "Where do you think you belong?" Amara answered, voice trembling. "I don't know. But if you believe someone like me can still do something good, I'm willing to start again, even from the smallest role." No one in the building understood why Selene added a name once considered unforgivable to the human-centered leadership training program. But she addressed the entire staff that day. No one should be forever defined by past mistakes if they're willing to face them without deflection. Because if we don't learn how to forgive the right way, we're just repeating the very harm we once suffered. Amara began again, with no title as a nameless assistant. But she became the one who helped train the new staff cohort on emotional intelligence in leadership, a topic she had once dismissed as soft. That year, for the first time, Ashford Commons was recognized by the Global Institute of Business Ethics as one of the top humane workplaces in the world. No one knows what the future holds for Amara, but one image continues to circulate quietly. Selene and Amara, once the fiercest of adversaries, sitting side by side in a late-night meeting room, silently reviewing internship applications from students across the US. No more power, plays only responsibility. No more resentment, only transformation. That day, Selene Ashford appeared on a live television program titled Human-Centered Leadership, Real Change, or Just a PR Mask. The host was Mason Clive, a veteran journalist known for his razor-sharp skepticism and relentless exposure of so-called manufactured role models. From the very start, his tone was as cold as steel. You think one dramatic reversal, one moving speech, is enough for people to believe you deserve admiration. What we want to know is who really changed you, or the image you created. The entire studio fell silent. Cameras zoomed in tight on Celine's face. But instead of defending herself or responding with outrage, she simply replied softly, "If you don't believe me, perhaps you'll believe someone who saw me on the day I was nobody." She turned to the crew and nodded for them to play a video. The large screen lit up with the image of a middle-aged woman with graying hair, dressed in a cafeteria uniform, Mrs. Judith Monroe, the canteen worker who once quietly saved Selene a leftover sandwich every day when she was an unpaid janitor in that very building. In the pre-recorded interview, Judith spoke with a raspy, warm voice. "I used to see that girl sitting in the hallway every night, eating a bit of bread and reading by the vending machine's light. No one noticed her, but I saw how she never complained, how she cleaned every corner, like she was scrubbing away her own shame. I had nothing to give, just leftovers. But she once told me, 'I'm not as hungry as I am forgotten.' And I knew that girl was going to do something." Back in the studio, no one said a word. Even Clive, the hardened interviewer, lowered his head just slightly. Selene smiled. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not standing here because of some viral moment. I'm standing here because there were people who believed in me when I had nothing to offer. People who didn't need fame to offer kindness. And they are the real heroes of this story." Mrs. Judith was later invited to Ashford Commons headquarters to serve as honorary sponsor of the One Sandwich Away Fund, a scholarship program supporting young individuals once denied a shot at their dreams simply because of their circumstances. And when Judith was asked to speak at the launch, she said just one sentence: "Never underestimate someone quietly making their way through the dark. Because they don't need a spotlight. They've already learned how to light themselves from within." It was a grey, wintry afternoon. Selene Ashford was preparing to leave headquarters after a long meeting when her personal assistant Lucas walked in with an unreadable expression. He set down a medical file on her desk and spoke slowly. "This applicant requested aid from the Ashford Health Fund. Late-stage heart disease, no insurance, No known relatives, but the name, I think you should see it. Celine opened the file. In an instant, the world seemed to freeze around her. Charles Langdon, the man who had once been her biological father, the man who walked away just weeks after her mother gave birth, pursuing what he called a life more worthy. To Celine, he had only ever existed through a few anonymous money transfers and a void too deep to name, growing up amid looks of pity and questions she never asked aloud. Memories she thought had long been buried surged back like a crashing tide. Charles was no longer the powerful businessman from decades past. He was now a frail, withered old man, lying in a public hospital bed, his eyes clouded, his heart broken in every sense of the word. No visitors, no legacy, forgotten. And yet, in his wallet, he still carried one old photo, Celine at 7 years old, grinning under a Christmas tree at the nursing home where her mother once worked. When Celine stepped into the room, he looked up, eyes wide in disbelief, stunned to silence. But he didn't beg. He didn't cry. He only whispered, "You don't owe me anything. But if there's still time, I just want to say thank you for not becoming a bitter reflection of me." Celine stood in silence. For years, she had imagined this moment would be filled with fury, that she would shout, walk out, and slam the door on everything he represented. But now, in front of her, wasn't the man who had abandoned her mother, who left her alone on holidays without a name to call. Before her stood a lost soul, confronting the absolute end of loneliness. And in that stillness, she understood. Forgiveness isn't to free the other person. It's to free yourself. The following week, Charles was transferred to the Ashford Special Care Center, a place where there was only one requirement for entry: you had once been left behind by the system. No one at the center knew who he was, but everyone knew he was the father of a woman who had turned her scars into gardens where others could grow. And when Celine signed the final sponsorship form, she said just one thing to her legal team. There's no clause that says we must love those who once hurt us. But if there's still a chance, I want to try so that other children don't have to grow up with the same emptiness I once carried. It happened just 3 weeks after Celine Ashford's emotional reunion with her father. She had just delivered a groundbreaking speech at the Global Federation of Leadership in New York, one that left the world buzzing when she declared, "Kindness cannot live in marketing campaigns alone. It must be measured by how you treat the most powerless when no cameras are watching." The speech went viral within hours. Media outlets hailed her as the human face of a new leadership era. But less than 48 hours later, a secret video was leaked online. In it, Celine appeared to say, "We can't save everyone. Some people are simply not meant to be part of a collective." The backlash was instant. The hashtag #GoAshfordHypocrite exploded across social media. News outlets began dissecting her past. But the harshest blow came from someone she once lifted up, Jaden Rye, the former unpaid intern at Ashford Commons, the young man Celine had personally given a scholarship to after discovering he was living out of his car and working in worn-out shoes. Jaden himself had posted the video with a caption that cut deep. "Maybe I was just a prop in her inspirational narrative. When the cameras are off, she's no different from every other person in power." The world tilted. People questioned, was Celine ever truly kind, or was it all a carefully crafted illusion? Sponsors began pulling out. Partners demanded internal reviews. She was forced into a public silence. Celine didn't argue. She quietly stepped into the shadows. But instead of hiring a PR crisis firm or a legal team, she asked Lucas, her closest assistant, to examine the footage in full. The result? The clip had been heavily edited. The controversial statement was actually a critique Celine had made years ago about outdated corporate hiring practices, not her personal belief. A press conference was scheduled immediately, but this time Celine did not appear. Instead, she sent Judith Monroe, the former canteen worker, now head of the One Sandwich Away initiative, to speak. Judith's voice was slow but resolute. "I'm not here to defend a CEO. I'm here because I was once invisible in a soulless system until she saw me. Celine is not perfect, but she's the only person I've ever seen publicly stand up for someone being humiliated, even when it cost her face in front of the board. If kindness is a script, then I hope the whole world plagiarizes it." The unedited footage was then released. Jaden publicly apologized, admitting he had been bribed by a rival CEO with a senior advisory role. Still, Celine did not return to the spotlight. She posted only one line on her personal social media: "When you choose kindness, be ready to be called fake. But don't stop, because the world doesn't need another cold victor. It needs someone who still believes in what's right, even when everyone else has stopped." 6 months after the scandal, Celine Ashford reappeared, not at an international summit or before the media spotlight, but at a modest graduation ceremony for a unique class. The Ashford Life-Changing Leadership Program, made up of former janitors, security guards, and service workers, individuals once overlooked by the very systems they upheld. There were no cameras, no reporters. Only the soft glow of aging ceiling lights and the warm applause filled the room as Celine stepped onto the stage. In her hands was a formal declaration she would resign as CEO of Ashford Commons. A quiet stir rippled through the small hall, but Celine simply smiled and spoke with calm conviction. "I used to believe that real change could only be made from the top. But I was wrong. The greatest transformations don't begin on stage. They begin in hallways, kitchens, and maintenance rooms, places no one notices, but where the heart of any system truly beats." After the speech, she officially passed leadership to Lucas, her loyal assistant, and the one person who had dared to challenge her on the true meaning of honesty. The next day, a 9-minute video was released across global media platforms titled "Celine Ashford, the Woman Who Chose Not to Take Revenge." It chronicled her journey from a nameless girl scrubbing floors in torn gloves to a powerful CEO, and then to someone who stepped down, not out of defeat, but because she chose forgiveness. She chose to rebuild from the ground up. She chose to leave a legacy, not of assets, but of dignity. The final scene showed Celine standing alone in front of a stone wall at the new Ashford Commons headquarters, where the names of over 500 frontline workers who helped restore the company's culture after the crisis were engraved. Beneath those names, one line was etched: "We don't need a symbol to look up to. We need someone who once knelt beside us." And Celine did. The video ended with millions of shares and one powerful headline from the New York Herald. In an era where everyone wants to speak louder, there was one woman who chose silence and still made the world listen. There was no CEO nameplate, no motorcade, and no custom leather chair flown in from Milan. Celine now sat in a small room in the city's impoverished East Side, where fluorescent lights flickered above and the laughter of children echoed from the classroom next door. In her hands were the files of participants in the Second Roots program, an initiative with no sponsors, no media coverage, and yet it was the first to welcome those the system had discarded, people who had dropped out of school, served time in prison, lived under bridges, or were once labeled as without potential. Here, they didn't learn how to write resumes or behave according to corporate norms. They learned how to reclaim their names, retell their stories, and stand tall in front of wounds that hadn't yet healed. and Celine, the woman once hailed worldwide as the media queen, now sat on the floor, coaching a blind girl through her first public speech, guiding a single father in how to speak up during meetings. There were no projectors, no PowerPoint slides, only presence. Her program didn't teach people how to achieve success. It helped them see they deserved a chance, just like anyone else. And right there, amid peeling walls, cramped space, and the hum of old ceiling fans, a second ecosystem was quietly taking root, a place where human worth wasn't measured by resumes, but by how one endured the dark and still kept the fire alive inside. When asked why she chose to start again, in a place no one paid attention to, Celine simply smiled and replied, "Because real light doesn't need a stage." On a drizzly afternoon, Celine received an unexpected meeting request at a luxury hotel. The rooftop boardroom opened to a glittering city skyline, and seated across from her were three men in dark suits, representatives of the rival media conglomerate that had once orchestrated the misinformation campaign, nearly destroying her career. But today, they weren't there to fight. They were there to offer a global advisory role, an 8-figure salary, full strategic authority, and a promise to erase the past. "All you have to do," one of them said, "is step back onto the stage, but this time on our side." The room fell silent for a few seconds. The city lights reflected across Celine's face, no longer bearing the hardened edge of a CEO, but the calm gaze of someone who had once fallen to the bottom and climbed back on her own. She tilted her head slightly. Her eyes held no resentment, no arrogance, only a quiet clarity that made the room shift in weight. And then she spoke slowly and unmistakably, "I lost everything once because I chose the truth. And I won't trade that away just to reclaim what once tried to break me. Power is not an opportunity. It's a test. And I don't need to take it again." Before they could respond, Celine stood, buttoned her coat, and walked out. But that wasn't the end. 2 days later, she released a full account of the meeting via an independent video, not sensationalized, not targeting individuals, just clean, clear audio recordings exposing one simple truth. Even when you have nothing left, integrity can still make the most powerful corporations hesitate. The video spread like wildfire, and for the first time, it wasn't a PR stunt, it was a moment of reckoning. A wake-up call for an entire industry that had grown too comfortable buying silence with money. When Celine officially declined to return to Ashford Commons, the executive board was forced to find a replacement. But no one expected the nominee to be Lucas Wren, the soft-spoken assistant who had always remained behind the curtain, eyes attentive, hands holding a notebook. A man once deemed only fit for a supporting role. But Celine had been the only one to believe Lucas possessed something more valuable than an Ivy League degree, deep empathy, and the ability to listen with absolute presence. On his first day in office, Lucas didn't deliver a grand speech. He simply requested that all executive office doors be removed and replaced with clear glass. Then he launched the 24 hours switch program. Each month, a janitor, a cook, or a delivery driver would assume a leadership position for 24 hours. Not as a gimmick, but so true leadership could hear voices that had never been respected. Lucas didn't change Ashford by enforcing reform. He dismantled class assumptions through quiet inner clarity. Meeting rooms now included a 10-minute silence rule, where everyone was required to listen without interruption. Every strategic proposal had to be accompanied by an impact analysis focused on the company's lowest-paid workers. Under Lucas's guidance, Ashford not only recovered from the media crisis, but became the first company in the industry to be honored by the United Nations for advancing leadership rooted in social justice. A reporter once asked Lucas if he feared being seen as too soft to lead. He simply smiled and replied, "If being soft means asking whether someone has had lunch before we start a meeting, then I'm happy to be called soft for the rest of my life." And in that gentleness, the world began to understand. Leadership doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it only needs to listen truly to the right person at the right moment without judgment. One quiet evening, while Celine was organizing old files at the Second Root Center, she came across a small worn wooden box, likely tucked away among the donated books by accident. Opening it, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and on top was a handwritten note with a trembling script. She recognized instantly her mother's handwriting. The letter had never been sent, but it was clearly addressed to my daughter Celine. Her hands froze, her chest tightened. Then slowly she began to read, line by line, her voice catching in her throat. "My dear girl, I know I may not be with you long enough to see the extraordinary woman I believe you will become. But if one day you feel tired, misunderstood, judged, or even betrayed, please remember that your worth does not come from what others call you, but from who you know you are when no one is left standing beside you." Celine sat in silence for a long time after reading the final sentence. She didn't cry the way she used to when she was younger. Instead, she smiled a soft, quiet smile, as if a layer of armor had fallen away to reveal a heart still warm, still whole, even after walking through fire. The letter wasn't some dramatic twist. It wasn't a secret that changed everything, but it was a final, spiritual anchor. It helped Celine understand that the strength she had spent her life passing on had always come from one woman, silent, unacclaimed, without degrees or a stage, who lived with unconditional love. And that love, even without applause or recognition, was the most enduring source of inspiration, not for the world at large, but for the frightened child who had once doubted herself and only needed one message: "You are worthy." One June day, Celine was invited back to the very place where she had once been humiliated, misnamed, and escorted out of the auditorium under disdainful glances, the World Business Leadership Conference, a former symbol of outdated values, where power was measured in stock performance, and speakers were chosen for prestige, not for principle. This time, she wasn't listed as a side guest. She was announced as the opening keynote speaker of the entire program. When her name was called, the hall seemed to hold its breath. Walking out from backstage was not a perfectly polished figure in a dazzling gown, but a woman in a simple suit, her hair tied up, her expression calm. Yet every step she took, steady, quiet, and purposeful, seemed to press a hush over the entire room. Celine didn't begin with a greeting. She began with a question. "How many of you have ever believed that kindness makes you weak?" The room remained silent. A few eyes lowered. Then she continued, sharing the story of a former student who had once been in prison and was now the founder of a non-profit creating jobs for the homeless. She told of a former janitor who had once been mocked for mispronouncing words, now serving as the head of training at Ashford Commons. And she spoke of herself, a young woman who once knocked on every company's door, asking for a chance, only to be told she didn't look like a leader. "I'm not here to speak about my success. I'm here to prove that when you build a world where kindness is the starting point, you don't need applause, you don't need validation, you don't need revenge. You just keep going. And time will take care of the rest." The room was silent. There was no rush of applause, only a few quiet tears. Then slowly, one by one, the entire hall stood up, not to honor a title, but to acknowledge that she had done what the system once swore was impossible. Celine bowed, not with pride, not with tears, but with quiet certainty. She knew this was not the final summit. It was the closing of one journey and the beginning of thousands of dreams that had once been buried. 1 month after the conference, when the spotlight had dimmed and the media had shifted to newer faces, Celine quietly returned to the Second Route Center, the place she always called home. But this time, she wasn't alone. She brought with her a young girl around 13 years old with neatly braided hair and wide, uncertain eyes that carried the same look Celine once had a child from a temporary shelter recently rejected by 3 different foster families. No one recognized the girl, but Celine understood that feeling too well, the feeling of being treated as a burden before you've ever had the chance to prove anything. They swept the floors together, wiped the tables, and hung a new wooden sign above the entrance to the center. Carved by hand into the wood were the words, "You were never too small. They were simply too distracted to see your light." That was Celine's final legacy, not a corporation, not a title, not a name in lights, but a place, a message, an opportunity for the people the world had overlooked. From that day forward, every person who walked into the center was asked to stop and read that sign before moving forward like a quiet ritual, a reminder that we are not here to save anyone, but to spark the light within them that even they might have forgotten they had. At that moment, it didn't matter that Celine had once been a CEO or had been honored around the globe, because the most important thing was never whether the world knew who you were, it was whether you had once seen someone before they ever saw themselves. That night, it rained. Summer storms in Chicago always arrived suddenly, as if trying to wash away what the day hadn't. Celine was about to turn off the lights when the landline, the one still used at the center, rang unexpectedly. She hesitated for a few seconds, then picked up. On the other end was a man's voice, deep and trembling slightly, as if struggling to say something that had taken years to surface. "It's me, Marcus Alden." The air in the room seemed to be still. Marcus, the once powerful CEO who had cost her her job simply because she refused to bow, who had erased her name from every promotion list, who had called her a temporary placeholder. "Celine, I know I have no right to apologize, and I don't imagine you need one. But today, my daughter Sophie attended a workshop at your center. She came home and told me that for the first time in her life, she felt heard, even though she's just a shy kid who never speaks up. And she mentioned your name, with a look I've never seen her before." Celine didn't respond. She simply closed her eyes, sensing something quiet, yet immense, a circle, gently closing. "Thank you, not just for what you did for Sophie, but for not letting people like me stop you." Marcus continued, his voice, now rough. "You've shown that kindness isn't a weak choice. It's the strongest way to survive." The call ended. No apology, no reconciliation, no invitation to start over. But that's what made it real, a thank you that wasn't too late for a journey that had already traveled far enough. And in Celine's heart, there was no triumph, no tears, only a faint smile, because sometimes the best answer is a healed child from the next generation. There are stories that don't need miracles or dazzling heroes to touch our hearts. They only need one person brave enough to hold on to what's right, even when everything around them urges them to do the opposite. Celine's story is exactly that kind of story. From a young woman once dismissed, once erased from the very place she worked, once standing in the shadows of halls reserved for the powerful, she didn't choose revenge, and she didn't fight back with rage. She chose the hardest path, to keep living with kindness, to quietly create change. and to let time speak on her behalf to those who once doubted her. The greatest lesson here isn't that everyone gets their turn one day, but rather, when you build everything on integrity, you don't need someone to give you a seat, you build your own table. Celine didn't win because of luck. She won through every small right decision, every person she refused to leave behind, and every moment she chose love over bitterness. The message I want to leave you with is this: in a world running too fast in pursuit of glory, sometimes what makes you truly remarkable is your slowness, your willingness to listen, and the compassion you refuse to abandon. You may not be celebrated today, but remember, the things that truly matter often take time to shine. If this story warmed your heart, made you believe more in the power of kindness, resilience, and human-centered leadership, please share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to Toch Story. Because we don't just tell good stories, we tell the ones that can change the way you see the world and the way you believe in yourself. Because who knows, the journey that touches a million hearts next might just be the one you're living today.